Ever wonder how a quiet, plant-loving boy, who was never supposed to be king, ended up losing the American colonies and his own mind? This is the wild, tragic, and surprisingly human story of King George III. Once upon a time, in an age of powdered wigs and duels at dawn, there was a prince who was more interested in vegetables than jewels. George William Frederick, born in London in 1738, was a curious, shy boy who loved science, farming, and yes, even talking to his plants. While other royals flaunted their wealth, George proudly showed off his prize-winning turnips. People laughed, calling him Farmer George, but that down-to-earth attitude would become both his greatest charm and his eventual curse. The royal family he was born into was a mess. His grandfather, King George II, couldn't stand his own son, Frederick, Prince of Wales. Frederick, in turn, did everything he could to annoy his father. It was a royal soap opera. Then, in 1751, tragedy struck. Frederick died suddenly, and at just 12 years old, little George became the heir to the throne. The kingdom watched with cautious hope. Maybe, just maybe, this quiet boy could break the family curse of dysfunction. Fast forward to 1760. At 22, George was crowned King George III. Picture it, trumpets blaring, 1,000 candles glittering, and in the middle of it all, a shy young man who would rather be reading about astronomy. He was determined to be different. In his very first speech, he declared, "Born and educated in this country, I glory in the name of Britain." The crowd went wild. Finally, a British king who was actually British. But behind the thunderous applause, the seeds of future disaster were already being sown. George wanted to be a good ruler, maybe a little asterisk to asterisk good. He worked relentlessly, studying everything from Latin to physics, convinced he could personally fix every problem in the empire. It was a noble goal, but that idealism would soon turn dangerous. In 1761, he married Queen Charlotte, a German princess he had never even met. Their first meeting was legendarily awkward. She barely spoke English, and he was so nervous he almost dropped the wedding ring. But against all odds, their marriage blossomed into something wholesome and loving. They had 15 children, yes, 15. And George was known for actually playing with them, something unheard of for a monarch back then. He played the harpsichord, took his family on walks, and leaned into his Farmer George nickname. The public adored this image of a humble, moral king. But being king wasn't just about being a nice family man. It was about power. When George took the throne, the British Empire was vast and powerful, but also stretched thin, like butter on too much toast. The 7 Years' War had just ended. Britain had won, gaining territories like Canada and parts of India. But the victory came at a staggering cost, leaving the nation nearly bankrupt. Someone had to pay the bills. And guess who George's ministers decided should chip in? The American colonies. You can almost hear the ominous drum roll. Now, George didn't invent the idea of taxing the colonies, but he fully supported it. From his perspective in London, it seemed perfectly fair. After all, Britain had just spent a fortune protecting them from the French. What could possibly go wrong with a few new taxes? As it turns out, everything the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, the Quartering Act teach, new law sounded reasonable in Parliament, but felt like an outrage in Boston and Philadelphia. Soon, colonists were throwing tea into harbors and shouting the famous line, "No taxation without representation." They started painting George not as a fair ruler, but as a cruel tyrant. George himself was baffled. He saw himself as a firm but caring father figure, trying to maintain order. The colonists, however, saw him as an overbearing parent who refused to listen. His ministers sent worried letters. The colonies are restless. But George, calm and resolute, replied, "I will never consent to their independence." And with those words, the spark was lit, and the American Revolution was about to explode. By 1775, the war was on. The world's mightiest empire was fighting its own settlers, ragtag army of farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants who dared to demand freedom. George was furious, but also strangely idealistic. He didn't want revenge. He wanted to restore order. He genuinely believed that rebellion was a form of madness, and in his obsessive quest to cure it, he slowly began to lose his own grip on reality. The war dragged on, year after bloody year. His ministers failed him. His generals failed him. Yet, he stubbornly refused to give up. With every lost battle, George would pace the gardens at Windsor, muttering to himself about loyalty and betrayal. He stopped sleeping, obsessively replaying war strategies in his head, convinced he could still find a way to win. Then, in 1781, the devastating news arrived. General Cornwallis had surrendered at Yorktown. The war was lost. George went completely silent. For days, he refused to speak to anyone. Then, late one night, he sat down and wrote in his journal, "I am now the last to consent to the separation, but the first to wish that it may be for the happiness of both." That formal, tragic line marked not just the end of an empire, but the beginning of his own mental collapse. After losing America, George threw himself into his work. He became a champion of agricultural reform, a patron of science, and tried to be a moral example for Britain. But his mind was already beginning to fracture. The first major episode of his illness hit in 1788. At first, everyone thought it was just exhaustion. The king started talking non-stop, for hours on end, about anything and everything. He'd stay awake for days, ranting about farming, the planets, or even whispering secrets to the trees in the palace gardens. His doctors were terrified, and his family was heartbroken. Imagine being Queen Charlotte. Watching the man you love, once a symbol of stability and reason, suddenly shout that he was made of marble, or laugh uncontrollably for hours. Some nights, he'd scream that he was dying. Other nights, he'd claim God was speaking to him directly. Whispers filled the royal court. The king has gone mad. The Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger, desperately tried to cover it up, hoping it was temporary. But the episodes grew worse, until one night George had to be physically restrained while screaming nonsense at his servants. This wasn't the dignified farmer George the public knew. This was something darker, scarier, and yet so deeply human. When the truth finally leaked, Britain went into a state of panic. If the king couldn't rule, who would? The heir, his son, the Prince of Wales, was everything George wasn't: lazy, arrogant, and obsessed with scandal. The nation dreaded the thought of him in charge. Dozens of doctors were called in. They tried every bizarre cure of the era, bleeding him, forcing him into ice baths, giving him opium. Nothing seemed to work. Sometimes, George would recover. He'd become calm, gentle, and deeply apologetic for his behavior, only to spiral back into chaos days later. The newspapers had a field day. Some cartoonists cruelly depicted the Mad King babbling to the stars, while others wrote that his suffering was God's punishment for losing America. It was a national crisis, but in a strange way, it was also a very modern moment. For the first time, the public was forced to see that even a king could suffer from mental illness. Just when everyone thought his mind was lost forever, he made a stunning comeback. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next dive into history. Imagine a king who screams through the night, a queen who locks herself away in terror, and a prince who sees his father's breakdown as the ultimate career opportunity. This isn't a fantasy novel. This is the true story of King George III, and how his descent into madness almost shattered the British Empire. It's the winter of 1788. Inside the grand candlelit halls of Windsor Castle, a crisis is unfolding. The king, the ruler of a global empire, is losing his mind. His screams echo down marble corridors. Servants whisper in fear. Queen Charlotte writes of her torrent of grief and confusion. And while the nation holds its breath, the king's eldest son, George, the Prince of Wales, smells his chance. See, if the king couldn't rule, Parliament could appoint a regent to rule in his place. And who better than the heir to the throne? But Prince George was no ordinary heir. He was charming, reckless, and famously extravagant. He spent fortunes on fashion, parties, and mistresses, racking up debts that would make your eyes water. He clashed constantly with his strict, moral father. So when the king fell ill, it was no surprise that his enemies whispered, "He's just waiting for his father to die." And they weren't entirely wrong. London was split. In the pubs and coffee houses, some cheered for the dashing Prince Regent, while others prayed for the recovery of poor Farmer George, as they affectionately called the king. The kingdom was on a knife's edge, divided not by war, but by loyalty. This division created a political nightmare for the Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger. Pitt knew that if the prince became regent, he'd be fired instantly, replaced by the prince's political allies. So, Pitt did what any clever politician would do. He stalled. He argued in Parliament that they needed to carefully debate and restrict the regent's powers. Essentially, he was trying to make sure the party prince didn't burn the kingdom to the ground while his father was unwell. The opposition, led by the charismatic Charles Fox, fought back hard. He declared the prince had an automatic right to rule. Every speech in Parliament was electric, filled with witty insults and thunderous applause. The nation was captivated by this high-stakes political chess game. And all the while, the king lay in his chambers, babbling incoherently about politics, planets, and conversations with angels. The newspapers dubbed it the Regency Crisis, and for a terrifying moment, it looked like Britain might just collapse. But let's step away from the politics and look at the man at the center of it all. King George's madness wasn't the stuff of caricature. It was profound human suffering. His doctors recorded him talking non-stop for over 58 hours straight, his voice raw until it gave out. He'd write letters that began, "Dear God," and sign them "Yours faithfully, George R., as if he were sending official correspondence to the Almighty. The medical treatments of the day were brutal. He was wrapped in cold, wet sheets, given powerful purgatives, and even strapped to a chair for hours on end. He would scream and cry, yet through it all, he never cursed his doctors. He begged for forgiveness, calling himself a poor sinner. But even in his most delusional moments, there were flashes of startling clarity. One morning, after a terrible night, he looked out the window and said calmly to an attendant, "How beautiful the sunrise is. The Almighty still paints." A haunting, poetic glimpse of the man trapped inside. Then, just as Parliament was about to finally grant the regency to the prince, a miracle happened. In early 1789, the king started to get better. His speech slowed, his thoughts cleared. He began to recognize people again. He apologized to his wife, his ministers, and his servants for his behavior, though he could remember very little of it. By February, he was well enough to meet with his prime minister. The two men, once at political odds, embraced in tears. The news hit London like a tidal wave of joy. Church bells rang out, fireworks lit up the sky, and crowds filled the streets, shouting, "God save the King." The prince's dreams of power vanished overnight. Pitt kept his job. And King George III, the man who had been mocked and pitied, returned to the throne, humbled but triumphant. He became a national symbol of endurance, a man who had stared into the abyss and come back. The years that followed were turbulent. The French Revolution exploded across the Channel, and George watched in horror as a fellow king, Louis XVI, was executed. At home, he faced protests, political turmoil, and the rise of a certain ambitious Frenchman named Napoleon Bonaparte. Britain needed a steady hand, and, ironically, the man once labeled mad became its anchor. He ruled with a renewed sense of duty, becoming more devout and more determined than ever. His relationship with his son, the Prince of Wales, only worsened. George blocked his son's desired marriage, forced him into a loveless union, and lectured him constantly on virtue. Duty, for the king, came before everything, even family. Despite his royal stiffness, the public came to adore Farmer George. He walked among commoners, chatted with farmers, and showed a humility that was rare for a monarch. During one walk, an old woman shouted, "God bless you, sir." The king stopped, smiled, and replied, "Madam, I thank you, but I am only a man." That simple act of humanity cemented his place in the people's hearts. He was more than a king, he was their king. But the shadows that had haunted him never truly left. By 1801, the symptoms began to creep back. Insomnia, confusion, violent outbursts. His doctors called it a nervous disorder. Today, historians speculate it might have been a rare genetic disease called porphyria, which can cause both physical agony and terrifying hallucinations. But the diagnosis didn't matter as much as the tragedy. The man who had ruled for over 4 decades, seen empires rise and fall, and conquered his own mind once before, was losing the battle again. By 1804, his world was fracturing. He spoke of seeing angels in the palace halls. He claimed the ghost of his sister visited him at night. His servants learned to fear the evenings, when the king's lonely voice would echo through the corridors, calling out the names of people long dead. Still, he tried to rule. He insisted on reading state papers, even when the words swam before his eyes. In a moment of heartbreaking lucidity, he told his physician, "They think me mad. But if I am mad, it is because I have seen too much of the world." The final devastating blow came in 1810. His youngest and most beloved daughter, Princess Amelia, died at the age of 27. She was the light of his old age, and her death shattered him completely. He wept for days, refusing to eat or sleep, until he finally collapsed, whispering, "I wish to die." From that moment on, the king the world knew was gone forever. His mind retreated into a permanent fog of delusion. He believed he was already in heaven, that Amelia was still with him, that he could play the harpsichord and sing with the angels. And so, while the king wandered in his own private world, the world outside finally moved on without him. In 1811, the Regency Act was passed. The party prince, now a middle-aged man, finally got his wish. He became Prince Regent, ruling in his father's name. King George III lived for another 9 years, blind, deaf, and lost in his own mind, a ghost in his own palace. He died in 1820, having reigned for nearly 60 years, one of the longest in British history. His story is a powerful reminder that behind the crowns and ceremony, monarchs are human. They suffer, they love, and sometimes, they break. The madness of King George wasn't just a political crisis. It was a human tragedy. A story of a man who ruled an empire but could not rule his own mind. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe. Imagine this. The sun sets over Windsor Castle. It's the early 1800s. The man who once ruled the world's greatest empire sits alone, surrounded by silence and the ghosts of his past. This is King George III, no longer the powerful monarch who debated ministers or fought revolutions. He's now a frail old man, lost in a kingdom inside his own mind. He's 72 years old, blind, nearly deaf, and, as history remembers him, completely mad. And yet, even in this state, there are flickers of the gentle, earnest man he always was. When he smiles, people swear they can still see the king who loved his people, his farms, and his family with all his heart. By 1811, the truth was undeniable. The king's illness had returned, and this time, there would be no recovery. His doctors, heartbroken, had to confirm it. The king cannot reign. Parliament passed the Regency Act, and George's son, the wild detritan prince, was, finally declared Prince Regent. He would now rule in his father's name. For the first time in half a century, King George III was a king in title only. He would live another 9 years, but his reign was over. The throne that had once been his glory had become his prison. At Windsor, life fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Every morning, servants dressed the king in his formal clothes. Though he had no meetings to attend, no one to impress. He'd walk through the gardens, talking softly to the flowers, calling them by names only he understood. Sometimes he'd hum old lullabies his beloved daughter, Amelia, used to play. Other times, he'd just stare at the clouds for hours, whispering to someone unseen. He was gentle most days. But there were dark moments, too, sudden fits of rage. Nightmares, where he screamed that America was lost, that his children were dead. And then, just as suddenly, silence would return. In those final years, Queen Charlotte could no longer bear to see him. They lived in the same castle but rarely met. "He is calm today," she'd write to their children, "but I cannot look upon him without breaking." She died in 1818, never truly getting to say goodbye. When they told the king she was gone, he just looked out the window and said softly, "She is still in the garden, I think." And then he smiled. Outside the palace walls, the world was charging ahead. Napoleon rose, conquered Europe, and fell. The Industrial Revolution roared to life with steam engines and factories. Britain was being reborn, but the king who had presided over it for so long was fading into a myth. People still sang, "God save the king," but most had never even seen him. He was a ghost in his own kingdom. And yet, his influence lived on. He had reigned for over 59 years, longer than any English king before him. He'd seen Britain lose America but then rise again, stronger than before. He inspired loyalty, pity, and even affection, but never hatred. Even his harshest critics had to admit, he was a good man, trapped in an impossible role. It was a cold January night in 1820. The lamps in Windsor burned low. King George III lay in his bed, silent. He hadn't spoken clearly in months, but that night, he whispered something no one could quite hear. At 8:38 p.m., the Mad King, the man who lost a continent, his mind, and his family took his final breath. He was 81. The bells that once rang for his victories now tolled in mourning. Across the nation, people wept. They hadn't just lost a ruler, they had lost a man who had lived and suffered right before their eyes. When he was buried at St. George's Chapel, the crowd was massive. Whispers could be heard. He was a good king. A sad king. A kind king. It seemed history had already begun to forgive him. It's easy to remember George III as just the king who went mad. But that's not the whole story. He was a monarch who championed science and agriculture. He was the first British king to truly believe in public service. That a ruler's job was to serve, not be worshipped. Perhaps that's why his story still resonates. Beneath the crown, he was deeply human, a man who loved too much, felt too deeply, and ultimately broke under the immense weight of history. The world he left behind was not the same one he inherited. His son, George IV, ushered in a flashier, more scandalous era. But few would ever match the simple sincerity of Farmer George, the humble king who believed in virtue, even as his own mind unraveled. And here's the great irony. King George III, the man America rebelled against, the man mocked for his madness, indirectly shaped the modern world. His stubbornness forced the American colonies to stand on their own, giving birth to the United States. In losing one empire, he helped create another. And in losing his mind, he reminded the world that even kings are human. They bleed, they cry, and they suffer. That, in a strange way, is his most powerful legacy. He wasn't just a king who went mad. He was a man in a world that demanded perfection, who paid the ultimate price for being human. So when you walk through Windsor today and hear the echo of bells from the chapel, maybe you can almost hear him, the soft, steady voice of a man who once declared, "Born and educated in this country, I glory in the name of Britain." He wasn't perfect. He wasn't always glorious. He was something better. He was real. And that makes him unforgettable. Thank you for walking through this chapter of history with me. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share it with your fellow history fans. Tell me in the comments, do you think King George III was truly mad, or simply a man misunderstood by his time? Until next time, keep your curiosity alive and your history a little dramatic. See you in the next story.